Let's take you to Egypt now, where world leaders have gathered for the Conference of Parties Summit. The United Nations Climate Change Summit is in its second and last week of discussions. The conference has been discussing ways to tackle climate change and get countries to embrace the idea of clean energy. This is part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. eNCA senior reporter Siphamandla Goge is in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and he joins us now. Good morning, Siphamandla. What is the latest coming out of the summit?
Well, today is the start of a very important week for the climate change talks. Conference of Parties, popularly known as COP. This is the 27th edition of these global climate talks. They've been going on for a number of decades now, more than 2 decades, but not much has come out in terms of those commitments that have been made by the developing nations. So this week is week 2 of COP27. Week 1 was mainly about heads of state, global leaders coming here to pledge their support and providing policy direction and guidance to their countries' chief negotiators and the negotiating teams to say, we support you. It's going to be a very tough and interesting week for COP27, simply because on the agenda, a number of issues that the developing world and the developed world are not agreeing on issues of adaptation, issues of climate finance. You're talking about the issue of loss and damage, and also the issue of Africa's special needs and circumstances. Those are the things that the African continent is coming to this COP wanting to find and get some positive outcomes out of it. So today and tomorrow, it's going to be what is known as the ministerial segment. Ministers of Environment and Energy will deliver their respective countries' opening statements. Those countries that have had their presidents coming here last week to deliver their statements will not participate, but today and tomorrow is about those countries that have not delivered their opening statements to say what is their positions when it comes to these climate talks. Let's take a listen to what COP President, the Minister of Environment from Egypt, had to say about a number of issues that were discussed and deferred to this week.
On finance, which is always the big elephant in the room, conclusions have been agreed for the review of the adaptation fund. Other issues were not concluded, and it will continue on the technical discussion, technical negotiations on Monday and Tuesday. Adaptation. Report of the Adaptation Committee, no conclusions, and up to the presidency to take any proposals on board. For the procedure matters, procedure conclusion on Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation, also procedure conclusion on the national adaptation plan. So we have the procedural part here have been finalized. On the loss and damage, conclusions have agreed on the report of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with the climate change impacts. Procedure conclusions on matter relating to the San Diego network under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with the climate change impact. Action for climate empowerment, glad to announce that conclusions have been agreed for the ACE. The gender, it was not concluded, and the presidency will continue with the co-facilitator on the technical negotiations on Monday and Tuesday.
Siphamandla, now you were stressing the African bloc's negotiating position, that here they're talking about the compensation fund, which deals with the loss and damage that is currently being seen on the continent insofar as climate change is concerned. There's that. There's also just the funding mechanism for that just transition. And as you say, the recognizing of Africa's special needs or its context where we have an abundance of coal, for instance, as South Africa. Just unpack that further, this particular position of Africa.
So yesterday, a group of African ministers responsible for environment and energy had a meeting. This is a very strategic and crucial meeting ahead of these talks resuming today. It was attended by a number of ministers from across Africa as a bloc, because they are coming here to negotiate as a bloc. Of course, various countries have got different special needs and they've got different positions, but as a continent, they are saying, let's put aside our differences, let's negotiate for a deal that will favor Africa, the continent that is bearing the brunt of climate change. We are the least of the polluters, but we are one of the continents that are facing the impact, severe impact of climate change, be it a crippling drought in the Horn of Africa, devastating floods in Southern Africa, including South Africa, Durban, as well as Umsunduzi 2 days ago. All of those are linked to the impact of climate change. So Africa is saying whatever we do, we need to negotiate as a bloc. We've got special needs and circumstances, but most importantly, we've got developmental needs, because a group of powerful countries, they've developed their economies using emissions and pollution. Now they want us to just transition. We will do that, but let's look at our developmental needs. And this is what the Minister of Environment and Green Economy from Zambia had to say during that meeting. Let's take a listen.
I wish to remind ourselves that as we are now participating at COP27, we naturally need to prioritize our interests as Africans, and I'm therefore encouraging all African states to remain engaged, to remain fully engaged in the ministerial segment of COP27, as this is the level which will ensure that the momentum built by the African group of negotiators is sustained.
And then lastly, Siphamandla, what has been the sentiment around the funding mechanism? Because there's still generally that call that if you look at the continent, it should not be a situation where you're having loans, but rather make sure that the majority are in fact grants, because you wouldn't want to burden an already burdened continent.
Absolutely. That is the general consensus, to say whatever the developing world is doing, or rather the developed world is doing to fund Africa's just energy transition. Take, for instance, the case of South Africa. You've got this $8.5 billion that has been committed by the developed world. They include the United States of America, United Kingdom, France, there is also Germany there, and the European Union, Canada as well. Most of it are just concessional loans, and the issue of the smaller percentage being grants, it's something that keeps on coming up. To say, in the case of South Africa, for instance, the country is already heavily indebted. You do not want to further burden a country that is facing socio-economic challenges. What are the terms and conditions of these loans? What period are they going to be paid back over? And what will Africa benefit out of it? So that remains a very highly contested talking point. Even the funding that is being proposed for developing countries to undertake their just transition, the issue of loans versus grants, it's something that is at the center of them accepting this funding. And developing countries have been warned to say, whatever you do, look after your developmental needs first. Do not abandon the coal resource that you have at high speed and fast pace, because you are being pressurized by the developed world that has already made economic advances using coal. Now they want you to abandon it. Take this just transition process and phase according to your own pace and according to your own developmental needs. And that was the warning that came from the African Union and NEPAD formation. Let's take a listen.
In the context of just transition, we of course need to balance the change of getting to a green economy and a zero carbon economy, and that of the developmental interest of the African continent and the African people. It is therefore important that as we finalize this last week of negotiations, we give our negotiators, through the guidance of the ministers, the courage to change the things that we have to change in terms of contributing to this just transition, and to say no to the things that will jeopardize our ability to get to the developmental stage that we have to for the interest of the continent and our people.